Welcome to Flipping the Table. Today, Michael speaks with rancher and consultant Spencer Smith. He is a founding member of Land to Market, the Ecological Outcomes Verification, or EOV, certification system. Land to Market is the world's first consumer-facing certification of regenerative sourcing, pioneered by brands like Eileen Fisher and Timberland Boots. Enjoy the show.
Hello, this is Michael. Today I want to have a conversation with an interesting guy who comes out of the Alan Savory world of livestock management and intensive grazing, holistic grazing. And some of you may know that Alan Savory was from what was once called Rhodesia, grew up there, kind of an elite ranching family, had an experience of watching land be degraded, saw the destruction of his country because of the racial divides and the war, and then went back and worked on studying how the natural world, how the natural herbivores and ruminants live on the land, and began to develop ranching systems, livestock systems, and land management systems that actually healed the land and created a movement around that. He's a controversial figure in many people's eyes, but I've always been very impressed with his work and have seen how he's impacted people all around the world. In places I've been, Australia, all around North America, down in Latin America and Mexico. There are ranches all over the world, big ranches, small ranches, that have been impacted and are doing good work to heal the land and produce good things. And one of the people that was influenced by him is my guest today, Spencer Smith. And I heard about Spencer before I met him because he has had an impact on people whom I know are serious about regenerative grazing of livestock. He is a self-described soil nerd who has raised livestock his whole life. From ranches to feedlots, he's really done it all. And from the Americas to multiple African nations, he studied the interaction of livestock, ecosystems, and soil. And besides working on his own ranch in Modoc County, which is in the far northeastern corner of California, he is a regenerative agriculture and soil health consultant specializing in regenerative enterprise. He works for farmers and ranchers, he works for land managers, conservation groups, governments, and obviously nonprofits. His specialty is optimizing cattle and grass to deliver healthy ecosystems, healthy animals, healthy meat, and profitability for his clients. What I really like about Spencer is he can explain the complex science that is the foundation of regenerative agriculture in a way that's easily digestible so that clients and listeners can grasp the information they need to either be successful or to make decisions about what they're going to purchase. And in recent years, he has been digging into the linkages between soil health and healthy, nutrient-dense meats. And we're going to talk about that today. So I'm really fascinated by him because I see him as another ally in the effort to scale up the work of agricultural producers who are helping to solve the many challenges before us. I believe the linkage between soil, livestock ecosystems, and human health provides what I would call a narrative pathway, a pathway we need to transform our current industrial meat system from one that harms to one that heals the planet and all its living things, particularly humans. So I hope our conversation today will show you what I mean. Enjoy the show. Welcome, Spencer Smith. Really glad to have you on the podcast today. We're meeting via Zoom, and really glad to have you. How you doing?
I'm doing well. Thank you for including me. Appreciate it.
It's a pleasure. So actually, why don't you just tell people where you are right now so they can locate you in their mind?
So I ranch in Fort Bidwell, California, which is in a rural corner where California, Nevada, and California all come together.
Yeah, is that Modoc County?
Yeah, it's Modoc County. Modoc is a really beautiful county. It's just a little bit smaller than the state of Connecticut with 8,000 people in it. So it's very rural, large ranching economy here.
Yeah, it's gorgeous. I've been up there a few times in my days. Used to go fly fishing and then used to go up into Eastern Oregon through there. So yeah, it's beautiful. You live in a God's country, as they say. So, why don't we start by you just telling our listeners how you came to not only ranch, but how you came to be doing the consulting that you're doing now that's helping ranchers become more regenerative.
Yeah. Well, when I started out of college, I went and I worked for a large cattle company in Nevada. So at that point, it was the largest cattle company in Nevada, Northern California. And I got to a position where I was the foreman and running all the outside cattle. That gave me the opportunity to have to work with a lot of agencies, either BLM, Forest Service, or Bureau of Indian Affairs on some leases that we were running cattle on. And I very quickly found out that I needed to have the language and have the ability to monitor and kind of communicate with agency folks so that we could continue to kind of maximize the effectiveness of our livestock on the rangeland, and then keep that rangeland open to us. And so I started working with the Savory Institute, which is a nonprofit based out of Colorado. And I did some training and did some work with them so that I could improve my rangeland literacy, so to speak. And then, it just kind of turned into an opportunity because I was used to running on such large land bases. And I knew a lot about how livestock moved and how to work in large arid environments. I started doing a lot of consulting work with the Savory Institute. And then I started a Savory hub and worked very closely with them for, quite a few years, and still do.
Mm-hmm. And did you grow up in ranching, or did you come to that later in life?
No, I grew up in it. My people have been following cows around in circles since they stepped off the boat. All I had ever wanted to do.
Uh-huh. And always up in Modoc in Fort Bidwell?
Well, no, my grandfather had ranches all over, Oregon, Northern California, and Nevada. And so growing up, my parents had ranches in Nevada and Oregon as well, kind of all over. But the formative years were here in Fort Bidwell, put it that way.
And so it's in your DNA. And you kind of moved into this direction and really following the work of Alan Savory and the Savory Institute. Was it the need of these agencies to be shown data that convinced them that you were managing the land properly? Is that what moved you into this?
Yeah, one, learning how to communicate with them. And what I found out is it's very difficult to get anybody to say yes. When you're working with agencies and you're wanting to change season of use on allotments, increase animal units, increase how those landscapes are managed, it's very difficult to get them to allow you to do that unless, you've done a tremendous amount of work, to kind of make it easy. So what I found out kind of the hard way was that in order to make anything happen on a lot of these allotments that we were working, I had to do enough work, have enough monitoring, have enough information on my side. It took years to do it, to make it easier for them to say yes than to say no. Because I had enough rigorous data on, as far as monitoring and rangeland health went, that for them to not allow me to continue to change and evolve the management of those allotments, they were going to have to do some work to do their own monitoring and kind of prove me wrong. And that's kind of where the work with Savory Institute started for me is, I had some meetings with range cons and they realized that, I was seeing things correctly in terms of landscape health and was articulating it well. And they finally said, you know what, you go ahead. They gave us back all the suspended animal units on those allotments during a drought and freed up a lot of management. And so maybe a lot of the listeners don't know, when you're running on public land, you as the rancher have the lease to the grass that grows, but it doesn't mean that you have the management decisions. Even though your cattle out there, the agency that oversees it, be it Forest Service, BLM, DIA, they have season of use and in out, or how many animals you can run, how you need to run them, where you can put them, where you can't put them. And so they have their own management that you have to follow. And so all of us as ranchers want to do best by our landscape and grow more food and increase habitat and do all the things that everybody would like. It can be tough on public land leases because oftentimes your hands are tied in what you can do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so working along those lines allowed me to kind of free up some management opportunity.
Yeah, it seems to me that this is a really important point about how you get people's goals aligned, right? So the conservationists, these rangeland conservationists, or these people that work for the government are, their mindset is we're trying to make the land better, but they have a certain way of determining what they think that means or how that's done. So you had to show them that you could achieve their goals, but do it your way using these, what we now call regenerative practices, but we probably were not calling it that when you were doing it, right? When you started.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Okay, so let's get into that. What is meant by regenerative ranching or regenerative livestock production? What are the principles that underlie or define it in your mind?
Yeah, so regenerative agriculture is going to be based in ecosystem services. So all landscapes are governed by basically 4 ecosystem services: the water cycle, mineral cycle, community dynamics, which is another word for not just biodiversity, but how that biodiversity interacts with each other to create cascading and compounding benefits. And then energy cycle or energy flow, how much photosynthetic time period we're giving each of these plants so that they can create maximum amount of liquid carbon and forage to both feed the soil and livestock or wildlife or whatever it is that's going across the landscape. Mm-hmm. So regenerative agriculture is a term that I think both describes a process and an output, in that the outcome of regenerative agriculture is ever increasing water holding capacity and water infiltration rate. So the water goes in the soil rather than across the soil. The outcome of regenerative agriculture to the mineral cycle is that we are not allowing, through regenerative agriculture, we're not allowing oxidation of our nutrients. And so they're not going into the atmosphere, but rather they're returning and recycling into the soil so that the subsequent growing season, be it crop or forage, has access to those nutrients. Community dynamics, enhanced, improved biodiversity, greater numbers of soil microbiology, and the benefits that lead from that. Deepening of the humus, deepening of that black part of the soil that kind of is the storage in the bank of nutrient density. And then, of course, energy flow, how much solar energy that lands on a square foot of ground is actually being turned into something that is usable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautifully done. Yeah. Going back to your description of what you were trying to do with the conservationists who were running those agencies' properties or telling you what they needed, they can't really argue if you get to all 4 of those things working, right?
Yeah, if you can manage your land or monitor your landscape and show improvements in those ecosystem processes, man, they're gonna throw whatever tools you need to keep going. And largely, it really wasn't that hard. It did take some monitoring. It did having to kind of learn that common language between how we communicate things as ranchers versus how ecologists communicate things. Largely, we're talking about the same thing, but if we're using different terminology, it can slow things up. Mm-hmm. But yeah, you show good monitoring of good outcomes due to your management. Every district office is run by different folks. I was lucky to really work with some great agency folks, and we were able to do some cool things.
Yeah, and actually, so these same principles that allowed you to work so well on public lands, obviously, they accrue the same benefits to a private landowner, and as many of the ranches that you consult with and are part of the project that we're working on around regenerative meat. I mean, any landowner wants to see these things happening if they're trying to raise animals or grow crops.
Well, you'd think so, yeah. But again, it's an education communication issue largely. But yeah, it's hard to find an issue with greater water holding capacity and greater water infiltration rates, right? Especially in the arid West, even on a wet year like this. Sure nice to have the water that falls on the ground enter the soil and be captured there for later use in photosynthesis, which As farmers, we're turning sunlight into money. And I don't care if you're doing it through commodities, if you're doing it through forages and meat products or what it is. If you can become more efficient and really optimized ecosystem processes, you can then create more photosynthesis, grow more cattle, sell more calves, whatever it is that you're trying to produce, and be a more successful, more profitable rancher on a healthier piece of ground.
Yeah. So let's get into kind of the basics. I mean, one of the things when I saw you speak a couple of weeks ago at the Napa Cowboy event, I really enjoyed how you described the coevolution of rangeland plants and ruminants, and how the loss of ruminants, I mean, you didn't say this directly, I've heard Alan say it, the loss of ruminants can create deserts. And so would you just talk people through the dynamic of how the plants and the animals that are eating them keep the system dynamic and ever moving forward?
Sure. So there's a lot of things at play here. There's predator-prey relationship, there's herd effect, and then there's the biochemical response of the plants to the actual herbivory that is really difficult to mimic with mechanical means. And so what I mean by that, when grasses or forage plants, be it grasses or forbs, come out of dormancy or develop as seedlings, they start in stage 1, right? So think of a sigmoid curve with 3 stages. And that first stage, that plant is sending its new leaves up, and the leaves are primarily built on stored carbohydrates or stored energy, either from the seed or from the previous year if we're talking about a perennial. Those leaves reach up and they start to photosynthesize. The energy that's created through photosynthesis in that stage 1 plant is utilized primarily to just build more forage, right? Build more leaf tissue so you can photosynthesize more. You get to a point where these plants are photosynthesizing more than they need to continue to produce leaves, I guess, because the leaf tissue is photosynthesizing at a greater rate than it needs to continue to grow. And so at this point, you're starting to really store a lot of carbohydrates into the crown of that plant, into the root system. And when it's doing this, it's also constantly leaking a little bit of sugar into the soil. And this is what's referred to as the liquid carbon pathways. The soil biology, for which there's a billion different critters in a teaspoon of healthy soil, then live off that simple sugar, C6H12O6, and that's the energy of production for those guys. Now, what the plant gets for leaking that liquid sugar into the soil is access to immobile nutrients that the microbiology can make mobile. So if you take a shovel full of soil, there's going to be, rock phosphate, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, molybdenum, all these different elements in that soil. But it doesn't mean that the plants have access to it. For most of those nutrients, in order for that to be plant available, that has to go through a medium of exchange from this soil microbiology. So the plant provides carbohydrates to the microbiology, and the microbiology in turn can make plant available these immobile elemental nutrients.
Yeah, so it's a symbiotic relationship between those microbes and the plant.
Right. So then the plant grows up, storing this, and then, eventually, if nothing grazes it, it'll go into stage 3 and put on a seed head. If we're grazing our livestock effectively, we would like to graze those grass plants when they're in stage 2. So they are already lightly secreting some sugar into the soil to break down elemental nutrients from the rock, bring it in, through microbiology, and then bring it into the leaf tissue so that more nutrients are in the forage. Thus more nutrients into the livestock. What happens when a plant is grazed is it shocks that plant. And that plant now has co-evolved with this grazing pressure to know, okay, my photovoltaic cells basically are damaged. So in order to rebuild them, I need access to fertility. So what that plant does is it pushes up to 85% of its stored carbohydrate into the soil all at once. By doing that, you get this vast population boom of the microbiology that consumes that sugar, and then a bust of that biology. And that's the breakdown of their, of that population, is where those nutrients come available to your plants. Mm-hmm. So then as that plant starts to recover, it hasn't shed off or lost very much root at all because it's working primarily on liquid carbon pathways. This is important because if we're wanting to talk about creating humus, creating greater nutrient density in our soil, and then availability to our plants, that's how we're going to want to do it, because we're strengthening the plant and also increasing the nutrient pool of that rhizosphere.
A pruning that stimulates a plant. That's what the animals are doing.
Yeah, that's right. But at the same time, it's also sequestering a ton of carbon, right? Because that simple sugar, is carbon based. And so as that breakdowns, we can create that where we're taking atmospheric carbon and turning it into sequestered carbon. And so without the livestock on those pieces of property, what you'd have is these plants would grow up, especially in the arid West, where we don't have a lot of biological decay because we don't have the relative humidity in the summer. These plants grow up, they go into stage 3, they set seed, they get hard, and then there's nothing there to kind of remove that lignified material from the plant. And these plants die from the inside out, or they lodge over and they create a duff layer that kind of smothers out future growth, right? So the next time something can germinate and grow through, it doesn't have that. It runs out of energy before it actually hits any light because there's so much dead grass. That creates bare spaces. That's desertification.
Yeah. And you can see it. I mean, I see it in lots of places as I drive around the state of California or in the West. You can see large areas that seem to be desertifying because of the lack of animals. I mean, before Europeans got here, it was, you've talked about this, it was elk and deer and antelope that were doing that. And there were lots of them. And in the wet parts of the West, obviously, or near the Rockies, there were, on the far side, there were buffalo and bison that were doing that work. But as we kind of limited what ranchers could do, and we killed off all the other species, we have this problem now. Are you seeing it as you drive? I mean, you get around. You must see a lot of this.
Yeah, you see it everywhere. So if you remove livestock from the annual grasslands of California, it doesn't take very long before you start to see coyote brush and chaparral start to populate those hillsides that, a few years prior were healthy grasslands, right? And so that's succession going backwards. And we can model succession, or we can take soil samples and understand what is going to grow by looking at what soil biology is occupying that space. And then we know kind of where we are in a successional state. But if we start to remove livestock, we're going to very quickly diminish the amount of fungal bodies in that soil state. And we're going to go more bacterial. We're going to create a lot of bare cap ground. And that's going to bring on tap-rooted woody veg, like I say, such as chaparral. And then we get into the situation to where, these fire cycles are so horrific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you touched on a lot of things there. I mean, the carbon cycle and the need to get more carbon in the land or in the soil. You talked about the fact that the connection to fire and the buildup of these really, really flammable plant materials that are around California. I live in Sonoma County. I've lived through 3 big fires here and had to leave my house 3 times. Had many friends who lost their homes. So it's just really awful to see that. And there is a place, and people are talking about the use of animals to control that kind of flammable material on the hillsides and in the countryside.
We hope you are enjoying the conversation. If you are, please rate our podcast and offer a review. Your voice will help us grow our listener base, which helps us sustain the funding to share these conversations with the people and organizations shaping a more just and regenerative future. A future in which the food and farm businesses are helping to solve the largest challenges of our time.
I want to kind of move the topic a little bit. I want to talk about, I read the articles you've written for Acres USA about the life cycle of forage and grass in pasture lands and how that relates to raising livestock for different purposes. There are people that are cow-calf operations where they're only birthing cows, raising for a bit, and then selling them. There are people that are stocker that are putting weight on those animals. And then there are people that are trying to finish cattle for market, for, grass finished, or maybe a combination of grass and grains that they're harvesting or buying. So I just wanted you to talk about those three stages and how people can actually optimize any three of those goals with their animals. You talked about it at that Napa event, and I thought it was really interesting. And put it, in layman's terms, so that the people that we know out there who are listening, who might want to buy really good meat, can relate to what you're saying.
Yeah, sure. So I think you hit right on it. Our goals in the different segments of beef cattle production are, they're varied. So if I'm a cow-calf producer, it's going to be very important for me to get a tight estrus on my cows so that they sync up and I have a fairly uniform calf crop, or the calves are born on a short time period. So I'm going to be wanting to graze my cattle and move my cattle to forages so that it promotes a healthy syncing of that cow herd.
Yeah, so all the cows are basically pregnant at the same time.
Yeah, and so we do that with our bulls, but we also do that with forage and how we are higher protein with enough soluble carbohydrates is going to allow those cows to come in, sync up, and get pregnant on that first heat. By having a tight calf crop, we're going to then, move through that calving year. Typically, we're weaning calves at 7 months, 7 to 9 months for most folks. By doing that, we want to have those cows on a protein-rich but adequate carbohydrate diet so that they're lactating, but we don't want too much of a lactation when those cows calve because we don't want to spoil their bags. Then as those calves start to develop, we want to maintain a high protein diet in front of those cows so that they build structure and frame and not necessarily get fat on the cow, right? We wean these calves, they go to the stalkers. From then, that stalker season is also about putting on structure and frame. We're going to want to be a little bit higher in protein, adequate carbohydrates. We don't want to go so high in protein that we're burning ketones, but we want to have enough protein that we're continuing to put on lean muscle until we get into that finishing state.
Well, I was going to say, but describe what stages. So you're talking about stage 2, but it's different phases of stage 2 when you were talking about when they're putting out sugars into the soils. I mean, when is that happening with the plant cycle?
So it's looking at the phenotype, kind of where that plant is. So all plants are different, right? So, Timothy comes on, say rye comes on earlier, your wheatgrasses come on second, you have all these different grasses in your pastures, right? Mm-hmm. Also, you have legumes and forbs and all these other things that are bringing more diversity and more nutrition to that animal's daily ration. Mm-hmm. What we want to do is make sure that we're grazing those cattle in a way during our cow-calf and our stalker seasons to where they have an abundance of protein. We don't want to have too much protein because then you start to burn ketones and they're losing body condition. But if we have too much carbohydrates, then they have to pull nitrogen out of their protein, out of their muscles. And so you get into a catabolic state. So those are your two extremes. One side would be ketogenic, one side would be catabolic.
So ketogenic, you're burning fat, right?
Right. And you don't want, we're not wanting to do that primarily because when we're burning ketones, it can create an off taste in the meat. And so when you see folks that are grass-fed beef producers, and it was worse 5 or 6 years ago than it is now. People are really come a long way in figuring out how to supplement cattle when they need supplementation to make sure that the beef that's being produced is good. But a few years ago, when the grass-fed beef craze was really getting hot, people were trying to finish cattle on really lush, green, rich, beautiful pastures because it makes sense. It looks good. You'd think that's be what makes beef taste good. But if you take an animal that's already mostly fat and you put them on something that's super high protein, and it's all ratios, right? Ruminants don't digest food the same way that we do. We are largely enzymatic. So we consume food, the enzymes in our digestive tract will help pull that apart and put it into large or chunks the size that can enter our bloodstream and we can burn it. Ruminants don't work that way. So ruminants are a large composting chamber. right?
Yeah,
So a cow takes
fermentation. Yeah, right.
yeah, fermentation vat. There you go. And so they're taking that in, and it's that cow, the forage that the cow eats is feeding the biology in the rumen. It's not feeding the cow.
Right.
The cow ends up getting the byproducts of that transaction.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens when you're feeding too much protein is that added nitrogen or available nitrogen in that rumen creates a population boom of biology, right? So there's a greater amount of biology consuming the available energy in that rumen fill than provides to the livestock itself. And so then it starts having to burn its stored energy, which is fat in terms of ketones.
Mm-hmm.
If you get into a ketogenic state for very long, the cattle shine, they look good, but they're burning fat, and that creates an off taste and color to the meat.
Mm-hmm.
And so it gives it that really irony smell and flavor and can make it tougher. If you're in grass-fed beef production, you're going to want to have adequate protein so that there's enough nitrogen going into that rumen to maintain a healthy microbiome inside that cow's gut, but not so much that it overpopulates and has, uses up all that available energy. So we want enough protein that the added energy is then stored as fat so that we can get intermuscular fat and have a product that tastes good.
Yeah.
And that pasture looks different than what most people think it should.
I was going to say, that's what I wanted to ask you. So like I said, I drive around the state of California all the time, and I'm looking at pastures. You described the pasture. When you're trying to finish cattle, you don't want to finish them in a really green, wet-looking pasture that's looks like it's just, it's like March or early April, right? So describe what the pasture would look like. A diverse pasture that has all these different species of plants in it that can be eaten by the cow. But is it going to be a combination of green and brown? Or what is it going to be?
Well, it's going to be the stage at which the bulk of that forage goes to. So as this grass plant goes into stage 3, where it goes into reproduction, right, building a seed head, it slows down photosynthesis by 85%. So as soon as you see that seed head emerging, that plant is starting to lignify. And it does that because the seed head's quite heavy. And so for the plant to hold that flower up for pollination, it needs to basically support it with a greater amount of carbon in that stem. So the plant goes from being very soft and pliable and photosynthetic with lots of phloem to a harder plant. As it does that, because photosynthesis drops off, protein drops off because your nitrogen's going down, and your available carbohydrate is going up. So you have acid detergent fiber, you have soluble carbohydrates, you have lignin and structural carbohydrates or fiber, right? And so as this cow eats that forage, you want to have a maximum amount of soluble carbohydrates and a moderate amount of protein. And the protein is going to be there to maintain that cow's rumen bug population. And then all that carbohydrate is the added carbohydrate that cow can then oh my gosh, I got more energy than I need. I can start putting it in fat. Mm-hmm. And then we get to a point where we're getting in that intermuscular fat, which lends to tenderness and flavor compared to that thick back fat.
Okay.
Both important.
Right. So you're describing how to keep an animal really healthy and tasty, and how to basically finish it in an environment like we live in here. Now let's talk about the link between the soil that the plants are in, the livestock that are eating that in the way that you described, and then human health. What is this? Because I know that in recent years, you've really been looking at that linkage between the human being's nutrients dense food intake and the kind of ranching that you're describing. So take us through that. How are they all connected?
If we can manage our landscapes in such a way that we are producing livestock, the food we need, and also getting the plants to produce the more photosynthesis, so more liquid carbon pathways, liquid sugar going into the soil, that is going to very quickly increase the nutrient pool of the rhizosphere, or the plant available nutrients to those plants that then can be transferred to the forages and into the livestock. And this is through primary, secondary, and tertiary metabolites, phenols, lipids, all sorts of different things that are happening. By doing this, it's a curve that can continue, right? So if we graze in such a way that maximizes liquid carbon into the soil, we can take a dead piece of ground and revitalize it into something that is every year producing a healthier, more nutritious product to whatever is consumed. Then, if you look at the work that Dan Kittredge and the Bionutrient Food Association is starting to publish, we can then create a meat product, dairy product, poultry product, whatever, that is of greater and greater nutrient density. Or just like the plants work with the microbiology to take immobile nutrients, calcium, say from rocks, and make it plant available, the cows then utilize that plant available nutrients and can make that calcium nutrient availability available to us as humans. And so that's kind of where we're at. And I think the researchers are finally looking in a way that can answer that question, is where does the most nutritious protein come from? And then how are we going to produce that for our population? And so we're a part of I produce grass-fed beef for Richard's Grass-Fed Beef, a label that serves the west coast of the U.S. And we're a part of the Bionutrient Food Association's beef study, where they're taking grass-fed beef and they're looking at a whole host of different indicators for nutrient density compared to, CAFO systems.
Mm-hmm. And are you feeling optimistic that, in fact, they're going to be able to show more micronutrients and therefore more nutrient density in the meats that are coming off these systems that are really managing the grass in the way that you're describing?
Yeah, so they started doing the research about 2 years ago, and the project isn't done for the white paper yet, but the preliminary things that they have published show about 150% increase in nutrient density and it's not all grass-fed, just like all grain-fed beef isn't created equal, all grass-fed beef isn't created equal. But of the grass-fed beef producers that are utilizing management practices to increase soil health, the products of those beef producers are dramatically more nutrient dense than the feedlot beef that is tested.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that's very interesting.
And I'd be happy to send you that.
Do send me that. I want to. I'd like, if I can, I'd like to share it with the people that follow us, and we'll put it on our website and all that, because it sounds really interesting. I want to read it. And this gets me to my last question for you, which is really about this idea of grain versus grass-fed. In my view, I guess I've carried kind of a prejudice that adding grain at the end of an animal's life is not that good. You hear a lot of people who advocate for grass-fed saying that grains aren't good for the rumen. Too much corn is not good for the rumen. It causes the kinds of problems that you were describing earlier for the animal. I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the different kinds of grains, the way to finish animals with grain. We work with ranchers up in Siskiyou County, for instance, who grow a lot of grain on their properties and could finish animals with grains from their properties rather than importing it from other places. And I just wanted to get your feelings about how grains can be incorporated in a positive way and remain a regenerative operation.
Yeah, so regenerative is in my mind is solely speaking to the health of the landscape. Looking at habitat, biodiversity, water, soil health, plant health, all the things. Can grain be a part of that? Absolutely. I'm not anti-grain finished at all. I think that there's a way to do it. I think that oftentimes in the beef industry, we're kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, by demonizing grain-fed beef. I know of a lot of producers that are producing very high quality products, in a way that utilizes some grain. I don't do it just because it's not my market, but like I say, I'm not against it. Where we can get into trouble, your feedlots utilize nutritionists so that they don't get into trouble. But if a feeder isn't really watching that ration, where you can get into trouble is bringing that grain into the livestock's ration too quickly. And what happens is you get what's called acidosis, lactic acidosis. And so if you increase soluble carbohydrates at a rate too quickly and the rumen biology can't handle it, you'll tip them over. Cattle will just start dying rather quickly. There are ways that feeders they can feed sodium bicarbonate and other things to help buffer that keeping it from happening. But for the most part, that's, a large issue that you're going to get. Also, you're increasing the amount of methane that's produced from those cattle as they start to digest that feed that's higher in carbohydrate. We also have to remember that, in a system, cattle have access to grain. Grain is just a seed of an annual grass plant that's of that commodity category. So in a lot of pastures, those seed goats are pretty hard. They move around. Like, you can find annual grain plants in a lot of different sites. If that grain's hard, the cow eats it. The difference is that whether or not that seed coat is broken, that allows that energy-rich portion of the seed kind of access to the rumen. So, if you're running that grain through a steam flaker or a roller or a crimper so that you can get the most out of it, you just have to be careful when you're feeding those livestock. Well, I think there's a way that if a person wants to produce finished beef in that way, that it's doable for sure.
Is there a difference between, I know ethanol plants put out a lot of spent grain that goes into feedlots, but is there a difference between, let's say we have distillers here who are making spirits. Is there a difference between that kind of spent grain and the spent grain that comes out of an ethanol plant?
Man, boy, that's, I don't know entirely. I know that every batch is going to be different, right? So again, when you're looking at animal health, if you feed a batch and there's more sugar available in one compared to the next one, if you're feeding at that level and you're trying to feed a lot of concentrates or grains to your livestock to get them fat, you're going to want to do it in such a way that doesn't create stress on that animal. Because if you get stress, you get oxidative fatigue to that animal, and it can set them backwards. They don't produce as well. They definitely don't want to put on the fat the way you want them to. And the meat quality and the nutrient density of that meat can go negative.
They probably suffer a bit too because their stomachs aren't working right.
Yeah, definitely. And so that's what I'm getting at. If you're feeding a byproduct grain, you really need to test rigorously so that you know how much available carbohydrate is going in there. Because if it's fluctuating a lot from day to day, you can cause some problems.
It sounds complex. You got to have, if you're going to be finishing animals that way with grain, you got to have someone who really understands the biology and the nutritious side of that grain and the ration so that you do it right. You said it was about ratios. You need someone who really knows what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. And similarly with grass-fed beef, if we're going to produce good, high-quality tasting beef that has those nutrient attributes that we'd all like to think we've got, we're going to have to up our game and better understand what the nutrient needs are of our livestock and how we can meet that as producers. And I don't think it's difficult. It just takes the desire to ferret that out as a producer.
Mm-hmm. So, one of the reasons I wanted to have this kind of in-depth conversation with you about all of this is because, as you know, you're coming on June 28th when we're having our big summit meeting on regional regenerative meats for the UC system, University of California system, for the 10 campuses and 5 hospital systems, and trying to get them to become committed to regenerative meat for the University of California. There are a lot of producers that have to be involved in this to supply as much meat as they need. And it's important that they understand really how to do it well. And that's why I really wanted you to come to our event, because I think, there may be producers there who need some more in-depth understanding, and maybe there's ways for us to bring you to meet with some groups of producers after our June 28th event to talk this through. I know you talk to large groups of producers, so it might be a good way for us to utilize your depth of knowledge around all this. And I appreciate you taking the time to describe this. It's amazing, actually, the complexity, the beauty of it. There's so much symbiosis between the plants and the biology in the soil that makes the plants more healthy, the symbiosis between the biology and the rumen of the animal that makes the animal more healthy, and the ability for that positive health to then end up in the meat and then give us humans more health because we can access micronutrients that aren't often available in, let's say, CAFO supported or CAFO produced beef products. So it's a really interesting picture of the need for recognizing and stewarding the complexity that brings health. And that's what you're doing. You're trying to help people do that, Spence.
Yeah, I think this is about as interesting a time to be in the business as there is, because there's so much energy at the forefront to really better understand what nutrition is and what nutrient density is. And so I'm really looking forward to the publication of some of these research articles that are coming out. I think it's going to be a game changer for those people that are interested in that. From the data that I've seen so far, they're two different products. And I think that's one thing that we all need to be very conscious of, is that high quality grass-fed beef that is fat, not just lean beef, but high quality beef, is a different product as far as, a different food product than your standard beef product. I'm not trying to pit one against another, but when you look at nutrient density, nutrient availability on the upside, and then toxins and lack of toxins that are stored in that meat on the downside, the grass-fed beef, the high-quality grass-fed beef is a no-brainer for, I think, most folks that are educated consumers. So Here in the next couple of years, there's going to be some really pivotal information out there.
Yeah, and that's wonderful. And that's why I think the med systems are really moving towards grass-finished beef for their patients, and why the students want it on the campuses, and why ranchers who are really trying to, particularly the young ranchers that I'm meeting, who really want to create a more high-value market for their operations, because it's so much tougher in the commodity world to make your operation survive through the ups and downs, the fires, the droughts. We really do need a new paradigm, and I think you're part of making that paradigm very clear for people. So thank you for your time today. Look forward to seeing you on the 28th of June, and best of luck in all your good work.
Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you the 28th.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to our sponsors, the Ladybug Foundation, Dan and Quincy Imhoff, Beth and Mark Wyatt, Cindy Daniel, and Doug Lipton. Roots of Change is a program of the Public Health Institute.